the video camera? You're good anywhere up and down through here? Okay, good. All right. Let me start with the preliminaries, the basics. How many of you all are engaged in consulting on data privacy breaches? How many of you all are affected by data privacy breaches? Well, actually, all of you are. So let me start. The fun part of it is look at the magnitude of this, but I want to put it in perspective about what's really going on with data privacy. So let's take a look at some of them. So we always think about, oh my goodness, this data privacy is something brand new, it's something there's been, and it's just an invention of the internet and only been in the past few years. So let's watch and see how much it is. So consider for the 20th century. Do you recognize what that picture is of? I know it's small, but that is the machine that they used to break the German Enigma code. Can you imagine? That is a whole room of sophisticated equipment that they used to break the Enigma machine. And you can imagine if you saw the movie, how impressive it was that they were able to break it with that kind of it. Another example is, for many of you may recognize this picture. It's Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed for passing atomic energy secrets to the Russians. The next one is probably even more famous nowadays, is Daniel Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers for taking important data and publicizing it with the New York Times. And for those of you who are sports fans, here's my favorite. It's the Patriots stealing signals and stealing signs from the opposing teams during in 2007. And then most recently is WikiLeaks. So that's sort of an overview of things. And this is only in the 20th century, bear in mind. But let's look at a little bit more. Consider digital data theft. Now, sit back while we watch these numbers roll across. Okay, personnel management, OPM had 22 million files on individuals stolen. Adobe had 38 million. RS had 40 million. Home Depot had 56 million. And as you can see the trend, what we have here. JP Morgan owned 76 million. Sony 77 million. Anthem was 78 million. TGX was 94 million. Now, let's go to the triple digits. Triple digits. So Target was 110. Heartland was 134 million. Equifax, as we know, was 143 million. eBay was 145 million. Adult Finder was 400 million accounts. Yahoo was 1.5 billion accounts that have been hacked. So when I said congratulations, all of y'all have been hacked at one point or another. It's just a matter of how many times you've been hacked. And then some others that are sort of undisclosed about the magnitude of it. What we use for attacking Iran's nuclear power program and VeriSign, of course, is not been advised. So what I want to talk about is a couple of things. See the top line. The top line of the issue here is ICT is suddenly becoming more relevant to national security, obviously, critically important. But for what I'm looking at is the roller impact of it, what's going on the next. So it's also becoming important in trade and investment policy, which is more of my area, what I concentrate on. And then the other part of it is the trade and investment rules are now more of a reflection of the security issues. And we'll see the vicious cycle that we're running into. So look at some actions by governments and accused of by government. First one, in 2007, 10 years ago, Russia was accused of disrupting Estonia's internet through cyber attacks in 2007, 10 years ago, a pattern. Russia was also accused the next year of attacking the Georgian government websites. And then also in 2008 was Ukraine attacking, Russian attacking the internet systems for Ukraine. And of course, as we all read in the newspaper, the accusation that they were adversely affecting the U.S. presidential election last year. It's a long-going trend. All right, so that was actions by governments. And for me, it's always in physics. Action causes reaction. So let's look at the reaction that the first slide causes. And so accusations by opposing governments, when they start hearing on the first slide, the previous slide, going on, now they got to get worried about what's really going on. we in the United States, we've had several examples. I don't know if you remember, but Dubai was going to take over management of U.S. customs ports, and the U.S. government said, oh no, we can't trust those foreigners managing the U.S. Customs ports, so that was rejected. U.S., Austria, and India accused Huawei Technologies, Chinese company, of cybersecurity and cyber espionage. And it's not just us in the United States that we have concerns about all those foreigners and what they're doing to the U.S. and trying to trespass within our data privacy. China also has the same concerns. They're very worried, and we'll see this several times. China's very worried about what Microsoft is doing, what they're making available to them. And is Microsoft selling products that provide backdoors for American government? And then some other examples is Chinese engineers working for Huawei in Bangalore were accused of developing some telephone surveillance equipment for the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And the other one that I talk about is the U.S. suspicious of Huawei's close ties to the Chinese Communist Party and the military. So action and then reaction. Action by government leading to reaction by government. And then not just governments are reacting, we also begin to see reactions by third parties out there. And the biggest ones are interest groups and different interest groups I'll come back to later. The intelligentsia and also the public. One of my favorite examples of the public reaction to all of this going on is Amnesty International accused Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo of violating the UN Convention on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by agreeing to censorship in China that was requested by China. So now we see action by governments leading to reactions by government, leading to reactions by third parties. But it doesn't stop there. Now, if we're going to have an issue, we have to have a government report. What are we without a government report to identify how important this issue is? So let's look at some of the more intriguing ones. In 1990s, the FBI came out with a report saying 57 entities were covertly trying to obtain advanced technologies. Also in the 1990s, an FBI report, cyber crime is the fastest growing problem for U.S.-China. All the issues, not South China Seas, not North Korea, the fastest growing, the biggest problem for U.S.-China relations is right on this one. And then in the 2007, 10 years ago, 108 countries were accused of developing cyber warfare capabilities. And then most recently, Huawei and ZTE, if you remember the stories about ZTE, was accused of being a threat to U.S. national security by the U.S. The House Intelligence Committee. Okay, and if we're going to have a report, what is a U.S. society without some lawsuits? Several I could have picked from, but one that was most intriguing for me is Western companies' compliance with cyber control and authoritarian regimes. Not just Amnesty International, but Chinese dissidents were also suing Microsoft and the others for complying with Chinese rules and regulations about internet cyber control, etc. Okay, so if we're going to have new lawsuits, that probably means we need to have some new laws or applicable laws, or even if we had applicable laws, we need to figure out how we're going to redefine the laws to catch up with the technology. That's for me is the most fun part about the law and the legal system. I had a good friend when I was working in San Francisco. He was appointed a judge, and he had the case that someone was accusing too much sitting in front of a computer screen was an OSHA violation because it was bad for the eyes, bad for the health, back, and everything else. This is the first case in the country. This is mid-90s, early 90s. And so he had to decide the case with no background, no special knowledge of the internet or the computers. And also, there was no other cases for him to decide. That was the fun part of the law, trying to stay up with technology and trying to find laws and interpreting existing laws. And fortunately, his decision was that it was not an OSHA violation. Can you imagine if it had been determined that it was an OSHA violation, we could only spend an hour a day at a computer or sitting in front of a computer? But life is interesting. So, you may not have ever heard the U.S. Alien Tort Claims Act. 1789 it was passed. It was never used for 150 years, but about 20 years ago, people began to use the law alleging that if they were a foreign party and if they were injured by a U.S. company overseas, then they could sue in the United States under the Alien Tort Claims Law. And this one had to go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the basic idea is it allows foreigners to sue in the U.S. for injuries abroad. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Amendments, they were admitted in 2008 because of a number of issues about trying to bring them up to date about the laws. And when Snowden was releasing information on investigations by the U.S. government, those investigations were being conducted under the 2008 amendments. And so they were authorized that that's how they were being done. And then the Economic Espionage Act of 1996 criminalizes trade secret theft. Notice, it's by U.S. citizens, which the U.S. government has authority over U.S. citizens, and also U.S. corporations, even if they're overseas. Doesn't matter if you're in the U.S. or you're overseas. If you're a U.S. entity, citizen, or a corporation, you're subject to U.S. laws. But also, if a foreign party, if there's any action by a foreign party in the United States, if there's some nexus, some connection for it. And then here's one that you should be really watching out for. This is going to be the most material, most significant change probably in the last 10 years. It's the EU data privacy rules. And every U.S. company that's exporting products, doing business in Europe, has to be able to start complying with them. They're much stricter, much more stringent than any U.S. laws and rules. So watch for this one. And the EU laws were basically in response to the concerns about U.S. data protection. Okay, so we have actions by governments, reactions by governments, reactions by third parties, then we have lawsuits, then we have some new laws that have to be developed. What else? So the types of reactions, just consider the types of reactions, and this will be sort of the direction, the lesson that I'm trying to evolve here. So you can have direct barriers on legal inflow and outflow of goods, services, and also capital. But also there's the indirect. And the indirect barriers are the ones that most people, foreign parties, are concerned about. And they range for the availability of information and to whom. The differential accounting standards, if you're involved with the accounting profession, you know the IFRS and the international rules for accounting and what's being adopted, try to coordinate between the U.S. and foreign governments. Investor protection, liquidity risk, microeconomic stability, and political risk are all indirect ones. So let's see if we can try to do some lessons from what's been going on. Now I'm going to be looking at three types of actions leading from the prior slide. So I'm going to be looking at political espionage, economic espionage, and then also I'm going to be looking at just in general privacy and security of citizens' information. So let's look at the first one. So I'm looking for cybersecurity factors. What can we identify? What lessons can we draw from what's going on trade investment barriers? So first factor to consider when you're looking at what is going to be impacting your business operations overseas and vice versa. The first one is close ties to the state in the home country. The best example is a foreign company is thought to be spying for its home country. So Microsoft is thought to be spying for the United States, and Huawei was thought to be spying on the United States for China, etc. So the first one is a company with close ties to a foreign country. And the example I gave you was Huawei. The ties resulted in a proposal by 3Com. It was given elevated attention, a much slower process for it to get approved when it was being reviewed by the CFIUS, is Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. In foreign party investing in the United States in a national security area has to be approved by the CFIUS. CFIUS is just a big fancy committee for a super committee composed of representatives from State Department, Commerce Department, Treasury Department, et cetera, and they all get together to review these proposals. And anytime they step in, it's going to be a slower process. And then if they say, oh, we need to study this one in more detail, it could be 6 months to a year delay. And I don't know about you, for many deals, if you put them all on hold for 6 months to a year, they ain't going to happen. And so that was the problem with Huawei. Then Lenovo was the acquisition of the IBM PC division. That for me is sort of silly because most people thought they were buying the technology for IBM PC. They weren't. They were buying the management experience and the international sales force. That's what they really wanted. Lenovo had much better technology than IBM PCs at that time. But what they didn't have is an international distribution network, and business managers involved and knowledgeable about international business operations. So that's what they wanted to buy. But the United States was hung up on in the presumption that U.S. technology must be better, and therefore that's what they're really looking for. So what is the conclusion? And this one is consistent from all the examples that I've run into and have encountered. So the closer that you are perceived to a home country leads to cybersecurity barriers due to political espionage-related concerns. So the closer you are to a foreign government, the more likely your host country is going to be very concerned about you, and the more likely they're going to be putting on some controls about how you do business, whether prior reviews or subsequent reviews. So that's the first factor to be considered. Now, let's look at the second factor. And this one is differences in cybersecurity goals. Now, here's one. You sort of think about all the cybersecurity issues are just amorphous and it's one side against another side. But when you look at them, what you identify, what you see is almost all cybersecurity concerns are between opposing parties in the Cold War. United States and Russia, United States and China, Europe and Russia, Europe and China, etc. All can be traced to the concerns to who was on which side of the Cold War. And let me give you some examples of it. So, for the country, cybersecurity major issue in the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. On the flip side, on the Chinese side, Shanghai Cooperation Agency is very concerned that the U.S. and European companies are trying to monopolize software and hardware ICT products. And then, as I mentioned before, China has expressed concern it's under a cyber attack from the U.S. in many kinds of things. So some company examples, barriers faced by Chinese firms in U.S., Australia, and India. And then on the flip side, barriers faced by Microsoft in China and Russia, expected on spying on users by backdoors. And so what is the conclusion? Home and host country differences on which side of the Cold War is most likely going to result in higher sensitivity on all of these issues, suspicions, and it's going to lead to accusations of political espionage related to the source, the origin of the country. So we got two factors that are tracking very well in terms of who is going to be suspicious. Third one, what about economic development level? Is there any correlation between what level of economic development you are and someone else is in terms of your suspicion of cyber activity? So let's look at some examples and see. So the foreign company based in a country with lower economic development may be perceived as less protective of IP. Our gut reaction says, well, that makes sense. So let's look at specific examples. U.S. lawmakers are expanding the national security to include economic security when they're evaluating foreign direct investment coming in the United States. So the U.S. is already doing this in terms of your economic security. China Vice Minister of Science has said that the technology affects national security through economic security. Again, different levels of economic protection. And of course, we all read about the lack of IP protection in China raises cybersecurity risk by China. I don't know about your experience, but I represent a lot of U.S. companies going overseas, and consistently what I find is if you've got a patent, I can protect it. I can protect you in China. All I need is to make sure that you have a patent in China, and most U.S. companies don't. They have it in the U.S., and I can't protect you. But if you do have a patent in China, I've got some attorneys that I work with who will not only file, they will send the police after you and arrest people and send them in jail. And it's amazing how quickly the negotiations go when someone is sitting in jail. Trade secrets I cannot protect. Trademarks and copyrights I have a better job also of protecting. But the problem is that many companies don't protect their trademarks. Let me give you a quick example. I had a company that was manufacturing in China. They were exporting. Their manufacturing facility was within 10 miles of the port to export back to the United States. Weren't selling in China at all, but they didn't, therefore, file any trademarks. They weren't selling, doing anything. But trademark covers manufacturing, selling, or using a product. A competitor registered their trademark in China, prevented them from exporting the good because it was being used in China until they paid them off, until they made a payment to release the royalty. So the mistake was not getting the patent or the copyright or the trademark protection. If you do that, you've got good chances. So notwithstanding what people are always saying, oh, Chinese, they don't protect IP, that's sort of ancient history. It's sort of an urban legend in my experience. Most people, and not just me, but we can protect if you're registered, if you're doing something in China and have registered. Moving along, Cyber Command at the Pentagon says IP theft is the greatest transfer of wealth. Greatest transfer of wealth in history, not just U.S. history, but history. And they valued it $250 billion. Now, the old record for biggest transfer of wealth was after World War II, when U.S. companies had old technology they didn't need anymore. The phrase was they did a fire sale, and they sold it to Japanese companies in the 40s, late 40s and 50s. And that technology was the basis for a lot of the Japanese companies that we now see. Old technology that was sitting on the shelf, and people say, hey, great, I can sell it, I can make a little bit of money, and I'm going to sell it to a Japanese company all the way in Japan. I don't have to worry about it. But obviously, that was not the case. But that was the greatest transfer up until the most recent accusation. And now we have a new winner. So what is the conclusion? Yes, absolutely. If you're from a different economic development level, usually a less economic development level, you're going to be perceived as sort of a condescending attitude, or the attitude of companies and governments from more developed economies, is that you're not going to be protecting IP, and therefore we have to be very suspicious of who you are, where you're coming from. So that's the third criteria. Now, let's see if there's any other pattern that we can see. So what about the extent of the data privacy regulations? So if I was to ask you without telling you about anything more, who would you say, most people, who do you think would say has the best data privacy protection? Most people would say the United States, right? But we're not. Not by any means. You agree with EU, or who do you think? Yeah, absolutely. If you're doing business in Europe, you know very well. So, an example I use, U.S. has stricter privacy laws than Eastern Europe and Latin America, and many parts of Asia as well. But EU has much more strict data privacy laws, and therefore, while the U.S. relies on voluntary self-regulation, the EU relies on legislation for the data privacy. And if we think of Equifax, how many laws did Equifax violate in the United States? If it was in Europe, you can imagine how many laws it would have violated. So what is the net result of all of that? Is EU companies are less likely to outsource data-related work outside the EU to countries that they perceive as having less data privacy protection, including the United States. They're not going to outsource it. U.S. are more likely, companies are more likely to outsource data protection issues, and I'm sure many of you have been dealing with outsourcing to India or to China, et cetera, from U.S. companies. So the net result is an impact, for instance, on one of my favorite places, India. So they're more likely to manage data for U.S. companies, but business process outsourcing DPO from EU to India is low-level value-added work, whereas from the U.S., I'm in the legal field, many U.S. law firms outsource a lot of their legal work. Accounting firms sending a lot of, I think over 500 million tax returns are now done. No, I'm sorry, not 50 million, sorry, 50 million tax returns are done by Indian outsourced BPOs trying to do it for the U.S. And where you can imagine the extent of the privacy concerns there. So from the U.S., it's high-end clinical trials, legal documents, credit equity analysis, as opposed to the entire gamut, something that a EU company will not be outsourcing. So what is the conclusion? Again, direct correlation between our perception of how good our data privacy laws are and someone else's data privacy laws in terms of how you do business, and also in terms of, for instance, EU regulations on outsourcing to India are much more stringent than U.S. regulations on outsourcing to India. So a definite correlation. So we've seen 4 of them so far. So let's look at the implications. It's nice to do a foreign investment. It used to be just your money was good enough to get you into a foreign market, but it's not the case anymore. It's your money and your home country. People want to know how good it is and how strong it is and all these other factors that we'll talk about. So it's 2-party investments nowadays. The party with the money and the government supporting behind that party coming in. So now you got to protect your digital assets. And you got to think about, in the old past, you just had to deal with your customers. Nowadays, if you think about it, you have to deal with not just your customers and the government regulations and interest groups. And what I always say is the toughest test is that you want to see your name and your story above the fold in the newspaper, what it used to be. So that's, for me, what I'm trying to drive and give advice on what you should be doing and not be doing. Do you want this one on the top fold of the paper or on the banner of a banner coming through on your cell phone? And therefore, you have to develop a specific strategy to barriers facing them. So, interesting. I don't know if you noticed that to get over the concerns that by the Chinese authorities that Microsoft products had backdoors for the U.S. government, they opened their software for Windows XP and Windows 2000 and other programs to security experts, not just in China, but also Russia, and then the UK, but it was really designed to open it for EU in order to get in acceptance from the EU, and they did it through UK engineers. And cybersecurity-related barriers are often established on the basis of perception rather than reality. And so the perception goes to many different things. It goes to where you were, and which country you were in for the Cold War, what you're perceived as your level of economic development, what you're perceived as your level of your privacy protection, and all those other issues. It's not the hardline stories that it used to be. This is the law. It's now in terms of, are you going to get reviewed by CFIUS or someone else? It depends on those factors as much as anything else. And then the other ones, as a result, it's much more expensive if you're in the technology field to be doing business overseas. And so you have to consider not just the reality, is this a good investment, but you also have to consider, my goodness, look at the other things that are going on. Look at what has to happen in terms of what I have available and how much do I really want to spend on those things. And you should allow several $1 million for the additional delays and also for the compliance with the rules and regulations in the local economy, the local government, the local concerns that you may have. And ultimately, you have to deal with a lot more parties than you ever had to deal with before. So it's not just going to the government and saying, when you give me consent to invest, you now should be doing pre-consultation with interest groups so that they have a conversation with you before you invest or before you undertake a transaction. And so, for instance, when Dubai was going to be purchasing the ports in the U.S. and the management of the ports, there was no conversation. They did not reach out to any interest groups or anyone. It would have been a better deal for a lot of companies doing international trade. If they had taken it over, they would have run it more efficiently and at a lower cost. But without that consultation before, it was not going to work. It was going to fail. So if you don't do it, that's the title of my topic. Dr. Strangelove, a great movie if you haven't seen it. And the theme behind it is that if you're not aware of these issues, if you're not doing the things that you need to be doing beforehand, you may as well just jump on the bomb and float away because you're not going to have any impact. It's going to be exploding in your face or under the seat of your pants if you're not careful. So there's my perception from 30 years of doing business internationally and more so nowadays in terms of how I'm looking at helping clients invest or doing transactions overseas. But there's a lot of experts here around the room. I'd love to hear from you. What problems are you running when you're trying to do business overseas from data privacy protection? What are you running into? Come on, this is a great chance for all of us to share ideas and to learn. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so for everyone who want to make sure that you heard is making sure there's no ID laws on what you're providing, what you're creating. Any other issues that you've run into? Has anyone tried to get approval from a foreign government and you've been blocked or been held up for a longer disclosure period? Because the two problems is usually longer delay, but also the greater disclosures required. Japan was famous for doing this one back in the 90s. if they wanted to slow up competition coming in, they would slow up the process for getting approval to invest, but also slow up the process for the disclosures and the amount of disclosures that were required, not only to require more time, but also to provide more information for competition. My favorite example is when Kodak wanted to start selling color film in Japan and producing it. The lengthy process took long enough for Fuji to come out with its own color film. And so, same thing happens. It's not just Japan, it's around the world, the types of problems. So those are, I think, the two biggest ones. What other questions do you all have? So as you can see from the first slide, I'm wearing two hats. One of them, and I'm really looking for your input, because I'm chair of the National Export Council, and our job is to listen to the problems that small, medium enterprises are having doing business internationally. And we're having a meeting next week where we're having our national meeting, and then we're going to be developing policy issues in terms of what problems are you all encountering and how can we help, because then we will be going on Thursday afternoon to meet with senators. We'll be meeting with Senator McConnell and others to talk to them. These are the problems that we're now facing. So here's your chance to have a direct or semi-direct access to our senators in terms of what are the problems that you're running into. It can't be all easy. Life is never easy. But do me a favor. I have this awesome email address, rbrown@globallawbusiness.com. And so rbrown@globallawbusiness.com. If you think about it, or when you're having a conversation, you say, oh man, I should have thought about this one. Send me an email, because I'm here to help you in terms of addressing these issues, these barriers. And that's what we fight. We're here to fight the battles to try to loosen the barriers. Also, you see the other title is I'll be the chair of the American Bar Association of International Lawyers. And we have 25,000 members in 100 countries. And so what we try to do is coordinate our laws and have these conversations among the lawyers. In addition, at the Export Council, trying to have the conversations with us as a medium between small, medium enterprises and the larger corporations. Anything else I can help you all with? Remember, send me an email message, rbrown@globallawbusiness.com. And thank you all very much for being here and listening, and I get to learn from you all. Thank you very much for this. Thank you.